Last night, something happened behind a closed door that the person you love was never supposed to hear about. It began with one ordinary sentence, spoken too casually by someone who believed an old secret had already been buried. But the moment those words reached your soulmate, the entire story of their past shifted. A memory they had defended for years suddenly looked different. A person they once trusted no longer seemed innocent. And most unsettling of all, your name became connected to the truth in a way nobody in that room expected. The evening had started quietly. Your soulmate was sitting near a window, barely listening as voices moved around them. A lamp cast a soft amber circle across the room. Someone had left a glass of water untouched on the table. Outside, headlights swept across the wall every few minutes as cars passed through the darkness. Nothing about the scene looked important. Yet your soulmate had been restless all day, carrying that strange feeling people get when life is about to reveal something before the mind understands why. Then a familiar name was mentioned. Their ex. Your soulmate looked up immediately, but they said nothing. They had learned long ago that certain conversations became more revealing when people forgot you were listening. So they remained still while two people nearby continued talking. At first, it sounded like old history, something uncomfortable, perhaps, but finished. Then one person said, "I still don't understand why nobody ever told them what really happened." The room changed. Your soulmate's fingers stopped moving. "What do you mean?" they asked. Silence followed. Not dramatic silence. Something worse. The kind filled with people exchanging glances because everyone suddenly realizes a boundary has been crossed. One of them tried to laugh it away. Another changed the subject. But your soulmate had already heard enough to know there was something underneath the hesitation. They leaned forward. "No. What did you mean by that?" That question became the doorway. For a long time, the person you love believed the ending of that old relationship was painful but simple. Their ex had given them an explanation years ago, one your soulmate accepted because there seemed to be no reason not to. They were told that timing was wrong. That feelings had changed. That life was pulling them in different directions. It hurt, but eventually your soulmate learned to carry the explanation like a scar that no longer needed touching. What they never knew was that the explanation had been carefully constructed. And someone in that room knew it. The first revelation was not yet the biggest one, but it was enough to make your soulmate's heart race. Their ex had apparently been telling different versions of the breakup to different people. To one person, they claimed your soulmate had become distant. To another, they said the relationship had become impossible. To someone else, they suggested your soulmate had already moved on emotionally. None of those stories matched. Your soulmate stared at the speaker. So which one was true? No one answered immediately. That was when something unexpected happened. An older friend who had stayed quiet until then reached into their phone and began scrolling through old messages. They had kept them all these years not because they expected this moment, but because they had never felt comfortable deleting them. "I thought you knew," they said softly. Your soulmate's face tightened. "Knew what?" The friend turned the screen around. There it was. A message from the ex, dated months before the relationship officially ended. But the message was not about falling out of love. It was about control. The words described how the ex feared losing influence over your soulmate. They complained that your soulmate was becoming stronger, more independent, more willing to question things. They admitted they were worried someone else might eventually show your soulmate what a healthy connection felt like. Your soulmate read the message twice. Then a third time. Their breathing changed. For years, they had blamed themselves for the emotional collapse of that relationship. They had wondered whether they had asked for too much, trusted too deeply, or failed to recognize something they should have fixed. But now the past was beginning to rearrange itself. Perhaps the relationship had not ended because your soulmate was difficult to love. Perhaps it ended because they were becoming difficult to manipulate. And that possibility led to the next question. How much had the ex actually hidden? Your soulmate stood up and walked toward the kitchen, needing distance from everyone watching them. The tile felt cold beneath their feet. They opened a cabinet without knowing why, then closed it again. Their hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the shock of realizing that an old wound may have been built on a false story. One person followed them. "There's more," the friend said. Your soulmate turned slowly. Those words landed heavily. "How much more?" The friend looked uncomfortable. "Enough that I think you should sit down." Your soulmate did not sit. They wanted truth without ceremony. The friend explained that after the breakup, the ex had stayed unusually interested in your soulmate's personal life. Not openly. Never enough to seem obvious. But they asked mutual friends subtle questions. Was your soulmate seeing anyone? Were they happier? Had they changed? Did they ever mention the past? At first, your soulmate assumed this was simple jealousy. But then your name entered the conversation. Not recently. Earlier. Much earlier than your soulmate believed. The friend revealed that the ex had heard about you before your soulmate ever seriously considered what you might mean to them. Your name had surfaced casually through a conversation, perhaps through a mutual connection, a social gathering, or an innocent mention. But something about the way your soulmate reacted to hearing about you had apparently unsettled the ex. Your soulmate frowned. What reaction? The friend smiled faintly, almost sadly. You lit up. That sentence struck deeper than expected. Because your soulmate remembered the moment. Not perfectly. Just fragments. A conversation. Your name. A strange warmth. Curiosity that seemed too immediate to explain. Nothing romantic had happened yet. There was no grand confession, no secret meeting, no plan. But your soulmate had felt something shift inside them, something small enough to ignore at the time, yet unmistakable in hindsight. And apparently, their ex noticed. That was when the energy of the story changed. Your soulmate began remembering moments that had never made sense before. Sudden arguments over harmless things. Questions about people they barely knew. An unusual coldness whenever your soulmate seemed excited about something outside the relationship. Conversations that somehow always left them doubting their own instincts. They had once considered those moments random. Now they wondered whether they had been connected. What did they do after hearing my reaction? Your soulmate asked. The friend hesitated again. They started asking about you. The answer chilled the room in a different way. Not because curiosity itself was alarming, but because of the timing. Your soulmate had not even begun moving toward you yet. The ex had no obvious reason to care. Yet messages from that period showed repeated questions. Who were you? How did people know you? What kind of person were you? Were you close to your soulmate? Had you spoken privately? Each question looked harmless by itself. Together, they formed a pattern. And then came the first true twist of the night. The ex had apparently contacted someone who knew you. Your soulmate's eyes widened. When? Before the breakup. The answer stunned them. The person you love had spent years assuming you entered their emotional story later, after the old relationship had already begun falling apart. But the timeline now suggested something very different. You had unknowingly existed near the edge of the story while that relationship was still alive. Not as a third party. Not as someone interfering. But as a possibility the ex seemed to fear. Why? That question became impossible to ignore. Your soulmate returned to the table. Everyone was quiet now. Nobody pretended the conversation was casual anymore. The friend continued scrolling through archived messages, slowly reconstructing events that had once seemed insignificant. One message showed the ex asking someone whether you were serious relationship material. Another asked whether you had ever mentioned your soulmate. A third carried a strangely specific request, "Don't tell them I asked." Your soulmate stared at those words. Something in their expression changed. They were no longer merely hurt. They were alert. Because secrecy changes the meaning of curiosity. If the questions had been innocent, why conceal them? Your soulmate asked for every message. Not summaries. Not interpretations. Everything. And as the old conversation unfolded across the glowing phone screen, a picture began emerging that none of them had fully recognized at the time. The ex had been gathering information, comparing stories, watching your soulmate's reactions, and quietly trying to determine whether the connection between you could become important. But your soulmate still did not understand the motive. Until one particular message appeared. The timestamp was late at night. The ex had written to a mutual friend, "If they ever start talking, I'm done." Your soulmate froze. The friend who received it had replied, "Why? Nothing is happening." The ex responded, "You don't understand. They'd see through everything." Your soulmate read that line again. They'd see through everything. Suddenly, this was no longer simply about jealousy. It was about exposure. And now the person you love wanted to know exactly what they were supposed to see. The room became almost unbearably still. Somebody whispered, "I never understood what that meant." Your soulmate looked around at the faces surrounding them. People who had been there years ago. People who had seen fragments but never assembled the whole story. Perhaps everyone had held one piece while assuming someone else possessed the rest. And last night, those pieces finally began fitting together. Your soulmate asked a question that nobody expected. Did my ex ever talk about what they were afraid I would find out? One person looked toward the floor. Another crossed their arms. The older friend exhaled slowly. Yes. Your soulmate's voice lowered. What? But instead of answering immediately, the friend opened another conversation. This one was different. There were fewer messages. The tone was sharper. And the person on the other side was not someone your soulmate recognized at first. The friend explained that this individual had known the ex before the relationship. They knew parts of the ex's history your soulmate never heard about. More importantly, they knew a promise the ex had made early in the relationship, one they never intended to keep. Your soulmate sat down at last. Because now the truth was entering territory they had never considered. Their ex had apparently built part of the relationship on a false story about their past. Not everything had been fake. There had been real affection, real memories, real laughter. That complexity made the revelation more painful, not less. People are rarely only villains or only victims. Sometimes they care and still deceive. Sometimes they love and still act from fear. And your soulmate was beginning to understand that the person they once loved may have carried both tenderness and dishonesty at the same time. But the hidden promise was still unknown. The friend kept reading. Your soulmate listened as an old message described how the ex had entered the relationship while still emotionally tied to something unresolved. They had assured everyone they had moved on. They had insisted the past no longer mattered. That was not true. There had been someone else lingering in the background. Yet strangely, this was still not the secret that changed everything. Your soulmate almost laughed from disbelief. How is there more? The friend answered, because that person wasn't the real reason they lied. The entire room seemed to narrow around that sentence. Outside, rain had begun tapping lightly against the glass. Your soulmate noticed it only because nobody spoke for several seconds. Then the friend finally explained. The ex had been afraid that if your soulmate learned the complete truth about the old connection, they would begin questioning several other stories too. Stories about where the ex had been. Why certain plans suddenly changed. Why particular people were avoided. Why your soulmate had sometimes been told they were imagining things when their instincts were actually accurate. The deception had layers. And once one layer broke, the others could collapse. Your soulmate leaned back, feeling years of confusion rise and rearrange themselves. There had been nights when they sensed distance but were told nothing was wrong. There had been moments when a simple question turned into an argument. There had been apologies they gave just to restore peace, even when they were not sure what they had done. For the first time, your soulmate wondered whether some of their deepest insecurity had been learned inside that relationship rather than carried into it. That realization hurt. But it also freed something. Because the person you love had brought traces of that old uncertainty into the connection they later felt with you. Every time they hesitated, every time they questioned whether something beautiful could be trusted, every time they pulled back when their heart wanted to move closer, they thought they were protecting themselves from repeating the past. But what if the past they were protecting themselves from had never been what they believed? What if they were punishing the future for a lie told years ago? Your soulmate lowered their eyes. And somewhere inside them, you came to mind. Not as a fantasy. Not as a symbol. As a real person who had sometimes received the consequences of wounds you did not create. That understanding changed the emotional atmosphere completely. Your soulmate remembered conversations with you where they wanted to say more but stopped. Moments when vulnerability almost surfaced and then disappeared behind caution. Times when your sincerity confused them because they had been trained to search for hidden motives. They suddenly saw your patience differently. And they saw their own fear differently too. Then another message was discovered. This one was never meant for your soulmate to see. It had been sent by the ex shortly before the relationship ended. The message mentioned you directly. Not just your name. Something about you. Your soulmate's friend looked at the screen and went silent. What does it say? Your soulmate asked. The friend did not answer. Their hesitation was enough to make everyone tense again. Read it. The friend finally lifted their eyes. I think you should. They handed over the phone. Your soulmate read the message. And whatever they saw caused all the color to leave their face. Because the ex had known something about you. Something your soulmate had never been told. Something that explained why the ex became so threatened by the mere possibility of you entering their life. The message said that if your soulmate ever learned what had really happened between the ex and someone connected to your past, the entire relationship would be finished. Your soulmate's hand tightened around the phone. Someone connected to your past. Now this was no longer only their history. It touched yours. How could they know someone from their past? Your soulmate whispered. Nobody answered. Then the older friend said something that made your soulmate look up sharply. Because I don't think your meeting was as random as everyone thought. The rain outside grew heavier. Your soulmate stared at them. What are you saying? The friend swallowed. I'm saying your ex knew about them long before you did. Your soulmate's heartbeat seemed loud enough to fill the room. The friend continued carefully. And I think they tried to make sure the two of you never got close. There it was. The revelation that shifted everything. Not simply that the ex had lied. Not simply that the ex had watched from the background. But that before you and your soulmate ever understood what existed between you, someone may already have been quietly interfering with the possibility. Your soulmate stood abruptly. Old moments flashed through their mind, missed opportunities, strange misunderstandings, messages that seemed to arrive too late, invitations that never reached them, assumptions neither of you remembered creating. Could any of those moments have been influenced? Could years of distance have started with information neither of you knew was false? The friend took the phone back and scrolled farther. Then they found one final message from that period. A message the ex had sent to the mysterious person connected to your past. Your soulmate watched the friend's expression change. What? The friend looked almost afraid to speak, not because of danger, but because of what the answer would emotionally rearrange. They met. Your soulmate went still. Who met? Your ex. And the person connected to their past. The words barely made sense. When? The friend turned the screen around. The date appeared. Your soulmate recognized it immediately. It was the same week you and your soulmate had almost spoken openly for the first time. And beneath that date was one short message from the ex. Only a few words. But those words suggested the meeting had been arranged for one purpose: to keep a truth away from both of you. Your soulmate stared at the screen, then whispered, "What truth?" The friend scrolled once more. There was an attachment beneath the conversation. An old photograph. Your soulmate opened it. And the moment the image appeared, they stopped breathing for a second. Because standing beside their ex in that photograph was someone your soulmate had seen before. Someone they recognized from a story you once told. Someone who should never have had any connection to their ex at all. And written beneath the photograph was a message that would finally explain why your ex feared you, why so many misunderstandings followed, and why the person you love may have been kept from the truth for years. Your soulmate began reading the message. Then their eyes widened. Because the first sentence contained your name. Your name was there, written in a message sent years before you ever understood how deeply your life would become connected to the person you love. For several seconds, your soulmate could not continue reading. The rain pressed harder against the window, blurring the lights outside into streaks of silver and gold. Everyone around the table seemed to understand that something irreversible had just happened. The past had stopped being a collection of uncomfortable memories. It had become evidence of choices made deliberately, conversations hidden carefully, and opportunities quietly redirected before either of you knew there was anything to protect. Your soulmate finally lowered their eyes to the screen again. The message was short. Their ex had written, "If they ever compare what they know, everything I told them falls apart." Your soulmate read it twice. Then they looked at the old photograph. The person standing beside the ex was someone you had once mentioned almost in passing, a former acquaintance from an earlier chapter of your life. Someone who had known enough about you to recognize your character, your history, and the kind of person you were when nobody was trying to impress anyone. That was the connection. The ex had not possessed some mysterious secret about you. They had possessed something far more ordinary and therefore more believable. They had access to someone who could contradict the version of you they had quietly encouraged your soulmate to believe. Years ago, when your name first surfaced, the ex had become curious. That curiosity turned into insecurity, and insecurity became investigation. Through mutual connections, they eventually discovered someone from your past who knew you personally. So they met. And during that meeting, the ex learned something they had not expected. You were not the threat they had imagined. You had not been pursuing your soulmate behind anyone's back. You had not been secretly planning to interfere. You had not even known enough about the relationship to become involved. Instead, the person from your past described you as someone who took emotional commitment seriously. Someone imperfect, certainly, but not manipulative. Someone unlikely to deliberately step into another person's relationship. That should have relieved the ex. Instead, it frightened them more. Because if you were genuine, then your soulmate might someday recognize the difference between a connection built on anxiety and one built on honesty. That was what the ex feared. Not that you would steal someone away. That comparison itself would expose what had already become unhealthy. Your soulmate slowly placed the phone on the table. So they knew? The older friend nodded. They knew you weren't doing anything. Your soulmate's voice cracked slightly. And they still made me suspicious? Nobody answered because the evidence already had. The old messages showed subtle comments the ex had made afterward. Nothing dramatic enough to be remembered as a direct accusation. Instead, they planted questions. Why does that person seem interested in you? Are you sure their intentions are good? Someone told me they have a complicated past. I just don't want you getting hurt. Those sentences had sounded protective at the time. Now your soulmate understood their purpose. The ex had taken ordinary uncertainty and shaped it into distrust. But another truth became clear almost immediately: the ex had not controlled everything that happened afterward. Years had passed. Choices had been made by many people. Your soulmate had their own fears, their own hesitations, their own responsibility for moments when they withdrew instead of communicating. Recognizing manipulation did not mean surrendering personal accountability. And strangely, that distinction gave your soulmate strength. They did not need to turn their ex into a monster to acknowledge what had happened. They only needed to stop carrying responsibility for another person's dishonesty. Your soulmate walked toward the window. The rain had softened. Their reflection hovered faintly against the dark glass, and for the first time that night, their expression was not shocked. It was tired. Years of tiredness seemed to surface at once. I spent so long thinking I was the problem, they whispered. The friend behind them answered gently. You were part of a complicated relationship. That doesn't make you the problem. Your soulmate closed their eyes. That sentence reached somewhere deep. Because there had been a version of themselves they had abandoned after that relationship ended. A more trusting version. A person who asked questions without immediately fearing the answers. Someone who believed affection could be straightforward. After the breakup, they became more guarded. Then you appeared more clearly in their life. And you met the guarded version. You met someone who sometimes wanted closeness and then panicked when closeness arrived. Someone who could read warmth as uncertainty and silence as rejection. Someone who wanted reassurance but struggled to admit they needed it. Suddenly your soulmate remembered one particular conversation with you. You had asked them a simple question. Why do you always assume I'm going to disappear? At the time, they had no answer. They changed the subject. Now, standing beside that rain-darkened window, they finally understood. Because someone before you had taught them that affection could change without warning. Someone had taught them that questions might be answered with half-truths. And without realizing it, your soulmate had carried those lessons forward. They turned back toward the table. Did they ever contact them directly? The room became quiet again. The older friend knew exactly who they meant. You. Yes. Your soulmate froze. When? The friend searched through another archived conversation. This time the answer came quickly. Once. Only once. Long before you and your soulmate had become emotionally close, the ex had reached out indirectly through the acquaintance from your past. The message never became a conversation between you and the ex. Instead, The acquaintance had been encouraged to tell you that your soulmate wanted distance. Your soulmate stared at them. But I never said that. I know. That was the missing piece. You had stepped back because you believed distance was wanted. Your soulmate had interpreted your distance as disinterest. Neither of you knew the other had been acting on incomplete information. The realization hurt differently from everything else that night. There was no anger in your soulmate's face now. Only grief for lost time. They imagined how differently things might have unfolded if one honest conversation had happened sooner. But then something wiser interrupted that regret. You were not standing at the beginning anymore. Whatever had happened years ago could explain the road, but it did not have to own the destination. Your soulmate could not return to that week and correct the misunderstanding. Neither could you. But two people do not need a perfect past to create an honest future. They need courage in the present. And that was the choice now forming inside the person you love. Your soulmate picked up their own phone. They opened your conversation. Your name appeared at the top of the screen. Their thumb hovered above the keyboard. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then they typed. I learned something tonight that changes the way I understand our past. They stopped. Deleted it. Started again. There's something I should have asked you a long time ago. Deleted again. Your soulmate laughed softly through the emotion. Every sentence sounded too small. How do you compress years of misunderstanding into a message? How do you tell someone that you finally discovered why you were afraid of something they never did? How do you apologize without turning an apology into another burden for the person receiving it? Your soulmate locked the phone. I don't want to do this through a screen. That decision surprised everyone. But it was the healthiest choice they had made all night. Because the truth deserved a human conversation. No carefully edited paragraphs. No interpreting punctuation. No waiting 3 hours wondering what a short reply meant. Your soulmate wanted to look at you and speak plainly. They wanted to tell you what had been uncovered. They wanted to ask what you remembered. More importantly, they wanted to listen. And if your memories differed from theirs, they were finally ready to hear that too. The next morning arrived quietly. The storm had passed, leaving the streets washed clean. Water rested along the edges of leaves. Pale sunlight entered through the curtains. Your soulmate had barely slept, yet their mind felt clearer than it had in months. They returned to the messages one final time. Not to torture themselves. To understand. And this time, something else stood out. The ex had eventually regretted what they had done. Near the end of the archived conversation was a message written months after the breakup. I handled everything badly, the ex had admitted. I was scared of losing them, and I ended up becoming part of the reason I did. That confession did not erase anything. But it changed something important. The ex was not revealed as some all-powerful architect controlling everyone's lives. They were a frightened human being who made selfish decisions, hid truths, and damaged trust while trying to avoid abandonment. Your soulmate did not excuse them. But they stopped giving them mythical power. And that mattered. Because hatred can keep someone emotionally attached to the past almost as effectively as love can. Your soulmate no longer wanted either. They wanted freedom. So they made one more decision. They would not confront the ex in rage. They would not seek revenge. They would not publicly expose private history just to make someone suffer. If a conversation eventually became necessary, it would happen with boundaries and clarity. But the first conversation belonged elsewhere. It belonged with you. Later that day, your soulmate finally contacted you. The message was simple. Can we talk? Not because something is wrong. Because I finally understand something I should have understood years ago. And when the moment came for that conversation, the person you love did not arrive with dramatic promises. They arrived with truth. They told you about the messages. The photograph. The acquaintance. The false impression that you wanted distance. Then they admitted the hardest part. I let what happened before you affect how I treated what was happening with you. You remained quiet. Your soulmate continued. There were times you were trying to understand me, and I made you prove things you never broke. I can see that now. That confession mattered more than any grand declaration could have. Because real love is not demonstrated by claiming destiny. It is demonstrated by responsibility. Your soulmate was no longer asking you to repair their past. They were telling you they intended to stop making you pay for it. Then you finally spoke. And your answer surprised them. You remembered the distance too. You remembered believing they did not want you around. You remembered wondering whether you had imagined the warmth between you. There had been moments when you almost reached out, then stopped because you thought respecting their boundaries was the kinder choice. Your soulmate's eyes filled. So we were both waiting? In a way, yes. Two people standing on opposite sides of a misunderstanding, each believing distance was what the other wanted. The realization was heartbreaking. And beautiful. Because suddenly those lost years no longer represented rejection. They represented incomplete information. Still, neither of you tried to rewrite history into a perfect romance. There had been genuine mistakes. There were times either of you could have communicated better. There were seasons when perhaps neither of you was ready for what you wanted. And admitting that made what followed feel real. Your soulmate reached across the space between you. Not dramatically. Their hand simply rested there, palm upward. An invitation. No demand. No prophecy. No promise that everything would become effortless. Just an invitation to begin differently. You looked at their hand. Then at their face. And the question between you was no longer, what did the ex do? It was, what do we choose now? That was the moment everything truly changed. Not when the secret was exposed. Not when the photograph appeared. Not even when the old messages revealed the interference. Everything changed when the past finally stopped making decisions for the present. Your soulmate understood that loving you did not require erasing what came before. It required learning from it. You understood that their hesitation had not always meant absence of feeling. Sometimes it had been fear wearing the disguise of caution. And together, you reached the only conclusion that could give this story a meaningful future. You would not rush. You would not build a relationship around proving the ex wrong. You would not mistake emotional intensity for healing. You would start with honesty. One conversation. Then another. Questions answered directly. Boundaries respected. Trust built through actions instead of assumptions. Your soulmate smiled, and something about that smile was different. There was relief in it. Not the relief of getting everything they wanted. The relief of finally knowing what was theirs to carry and what was not. The ex's secret had changed everything, but not because it guaranteed some perfect ending. It changed everything because truth returned choice to both of you. The past could explain you. It could teach you. It could even humble you. But it could no longer command you. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden inside this fictional story, beloved child. Sometimes the revelation we desperately want is not the one that tells us who will stay, who will return, or exactly what tomorrow will bring. Sometimes the greatest revelation is discovering what no longer deserves authority over our hearts. May you have the courage to question the stories that made you feel unworthy of honest love. May you recognize the difference between intuition and old fear. May you never confuse another person's deception with your value. May you forgive without surrendering your boundaries, love without abandoning your wisdom, and walk toward the future without demanding that it repay every disappointment of the past. May your heart remain soft without becoming defenseless. May your mind remain discerning without becoming suspicious of every kindness. And when a relationship deserves another chapter, may it be written with clearer words, steadier hands, and the kind of honesty that never requires someone to shrink in order to feel secure. If this story spoke to something in your heart, share in the comments what part stayed with you most. And if you enjoy these fictional inspirational stories of love, healing, mystery, and second chances, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next journey. Until then, may peace settle over everything you cannot change, wisdom guide everything you still can, and may the next chapter of your life be shaped not by yesterday's hidden truth, but by today's courageous choice.